The guiding concepts of humanism, Bildung or culture. The concept of Bildung most clearly indicates the profound intellectual change that still causes us to experience the century of Goethe as contemporary, whereas the Baroque era appears historically remote. Key concepts and words which we still use acquired their special stamp then, and if we are not to be swept along by language, but to strive for a reasoned historical self-understanding, we must face a whole host of questions about verbal and conceptual history. In what follows, it is possible to do no more than begin the great task that faces investigators as an aid to our philosophical inquiry. Concepts such as art, history, the creative, worldview, experience, genius, external world, interiority, expression, style, symbol, which we take to be self-evident, contain a wealth of history. If we consider the concept of Bildung, whose importance for the human sciences we have emphasized, we are in a fortunate situation. Here, a previous investigation gives us a fine overview of the history of the word. Its origin in medieval mysticism, its continuance in the mysticism of the Baroque, its religious spiritualization in Klopstock's Messiah, which dominates the whole period, and finally the basic definition Herder gives it. Rising up to humanity through culture. The cult of Bildung in the 19th century preserved the profounder dimension of the word, and our notion of Bildung is determined by it. The first important thing to note about the usual content of the word Bildung is that the earlier idea of a natural form, which refers to external appearance, the shape of the limbs, the well-formed figure, and in general to the shapes created by nature, e.g. a mountain formation, Gebirgsbildung, was at that time detached almost entirely from the new idea. Now Bildung is intimately associated with the idea of culture and designates primarily the properly human way of developing one's natural talents and capacities. Between Kant and Hegel, the form Herder had given to the concept was filled out. Kant still does not use the word Bildung in this connection. He speaks of cultivating a capacity, or natural talent, which as such is an act of freedom by the acting subject. Thus, among duties to oneself, he mentions not letting one's talents rust, but without using the word Bildung, however. When Hegel takes up the same Kantian idea of duties to oneself, he already speaks of Sichbilden, educating or cultivating oneself, and Bildung. And Wilhelm von Humboldt, with his sensitive ear, already detects a difference in meaning between Kultur and Bildung. But when in our language we say Bildung, we mean something both higher and more inward, namely the disposition of mind, which from the knowledge and the feeling of the total intellectual and moral endeavor flows harmoniously into sensibility and character. Bildung here no longer means culture, i.e., developing one's capacities or talents. Rather, the rise of the word Bildung evokes the ancient mystical tradition according to which man carries in his soul the image of God, after whom he is fashioned, and which man must cultivate in himself. The Latin equivalent for Bildung is formatio, with related words in other languages, e.g., in English, in Shaftesbury, form, and formation. In German, too, the corresponding derivations of the idea of forma, e.g., Formierung, and formation, have long vied with the word Bildung. Since Aristotelianism of the Renaissance, the word forma has been completely separated from its technical meaning and interpreted in a purely dynamic and natural way. Yet the victory of the word Bildung over form does not seem to be fortuitous, for in Bildung there is Bild. The idea of form lacks the mysterious ambiguity of Bild, which comprehends both Nachbild, image, copy, and Vorbild, model. In accordance with the frequent transition from becoming to being, Bildung, like the contemporary use of the German word formation, describes more the result of the process of becoming than the process itself. The transition is especially clear here because the result of Bildung is not achieved in the manner of a technical construction, but grows out of an inner process of formation and cultivation, and therefore constantly remains in a state of continual Bildung. It is not accidental that in this respect, the word Bildung resembles the Greek physis. Like nature, Bildung has no goals outside itself. The word and thing Bildungsziel, the goal of cultivation, is to be regarded with the suspicion appropriate to such a secondary kind of Bildung. Bildung as such cannot be a goal. It cannot as such be sought, except in the reflective thematic of the educator. In having no goals outside itself, the concept of Bildung transcends that of the mere cultivation of given talents, from which concept it is derived. The cultivation of a talent is the development of something that is given, so that practicing and cultivating it is a mere means to an end. Thus, the educational content of a grammar book is simply a means, and not itself an end. Assimilating it simply improves one's linguistic ability. In Bildung, by contrast, that by which and through which one is formed becomes completely one's own. To some extent, everything that is received is absorbed, but in Bildung what is absorbed is not like a means that has lost its function. Rather, in acquired Bildung nothing disappears, but everything is preserved. Bildung is a genuine historical idea, and because of this historical character of preservation, it is important for understanding in the human sciences. Thus, even a preliminary glance at the linguistic history of Bildung introduces us to the circle of historical ideas that Hegel first introduced into the realm of first philosophy. In fact, Hegel has worked out very astutely what Bildung is. We follow him initially. He saw also that philosophy, and we may add the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften, has in Bildung the condition of its existence. For the being of Geist, spirit, has an essential connection with the idea of Bildung. Man is characterized by the break with the immediate and the natural that the intellectual, rational side of his nature demands of him. In this sphere, he is not by nature what he should be, and hence he needs Bildung. What Hegel calls the formal nature of Bildung depends on its universality. In the concept of rising to the universal, Hegel offers a unified conception of what his age understood by Bildung. Rising to the universal is not limited to theoretical Bildung, and does not mean only a theoretical orientation in contrast to a practical one, but covers the essential character of human rationality as a whole. It is the universal nature of human Bildung, to constitute itself as a universal intellectual being. Whoever abandons himself to his particularity is ungebildet, unformed, e.g., if someone gives way to blind anger without measure or sense of proportion. Hegel shows that basically such a man is lacking in the power of abstraction. He cannot turn his gaze from himself towards something universal, from which his own particular being is determined in measure and proportion. Hence Bildung, as rising to the universal, is a task for man. It requires sacrificing particularity for the sake of the universal. But negatively put, sacrificing particularity means the restraint of desire and hence freedom from the object of desire and freedom for its objectivity. Here the deductions of the phenomenological dialectic complement what is stated in the Propädeutik. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel works out the genesis of a truly free self-consciousness in and for itself, and he shows that the essence of work is to form the thing rather than consume it. In the independent existence that work gives the thing, working consciousness finds itself again as an independent consciousness. Work is restrained desire. In forming the object, that is, in being selflessly active and concerned with a universal, working consciousness raises itself above the immediacy of its existence to universality, or as Hegel puts it, by forming the thing it forms itself. What he means is that in acquiring a capacity, a skill, man gains the sense of himself. What seemed denied him in the selflessness of serving, inasmuch as he subjected himself to a frame of mind that was alien to him, becomes part of him inasmuch as he is working consciousness. As such, he finds in himself his own frame of mind, and it is quite right to say of work that it forms. The self-awareness of working consciousness contains all the elements that make up practical Bildung, the distancing from the immediacy of desire, of personal need and private interest, and the exacting demand of a universal. In his Propädeutik, Hegel demonstrates the nature of practical Bildung, of taking the universal upon oneself by means of a number of examples. It is found in the moderation which limits the excessive satisfaction of one's needs and use of one's powers by a general consideration, that of health. It is found in the circumspection that, while concerned with the individual situation or business, remains open to observing what else might be necessary. But every choice of profession has something of this. For every profession has something about it, of fate, of external necessity. It demands that one give oneself to tasks that one would not seek out as a private aim. Practical building is seen in one's fulfilling one's profession wholly, in all its aspects. But this includes overcoming the element in it that is alien to the particularity, which is oneself, and making it wholly one's own. Thus, to give oneself to the universality of a profession is at the same time to know how to limit oneself, i.e., to make one's profession wholly one's concern. Then it is no longer a limitation. Even in this description of practical Bildung by Hegel, one can recognize the basic character of the historical spirit. To reconcile itself with itself, to recognize oneself in other being. It becomes completely clear in the idea of theoretical Bildung, for to have a theoretical stance is, as such, already alienation, namely the demand that one deal with something that is not immediate, something that is alien, with something that belongs to memory and to thought. Theoretical Bildung leads beyond what man knows and experiences immediately. It consists in learning to affirm what is different from oneself and to find universal viewpoints from which one can grasp the thing, the objective thing in its freedom, without selfish interest. That is why acquiring Bildung always involves the development of theoretical interests, and Hegel declares the world and language of antiquity to be especially suitable for this, since this world is remote and alien enough to effect the necessary separation of ourselves from ourselves. But it contains at the same time all the exit points and threads of the return to oneself, for becoming acquainted with it, and for finding oneself again, but oneself according to the truly universal essence of spirit. In these words of Hegel, the gymnasium director, we recognize the classicist prejudice that it is particularly in the world of classical antiquity that the universal nature of the spirit can most easily be found. But the basic idea is correct. To recognize one's own in the alien, to become at home in it, is the basic movement of spirit, whose being consists only in returning to itself from what is other. Hence all theoretical Bildung, even acquiring foreign languages and conceptual worlds, is merely the continuation of a process of Bildung that begins much earlier. Every single individual who raises himself out of his natural being to the spiritual finds in the language, customs, and institutions of his people a pre-given body of material, which as in learning to speak, he has to make his own. Thus, every individual is always engaged in the process of Bildung and in getting beyond his naturalness, inasmuch as the world into which he is growing is one that is humanly constituted through language and custom. Hegel emphasizes that a people gives itself its existence in its world. It works out from itself and thus exteriorizes what it is in itself. Thus, what constitutes the essence of Bildung is clearly not alienation as such, but the return to oneself, which presupposes alienation to be sure. However, Bildung is not to be understood only as the process of historically raising the mind to the universal. It is at the same time the element within which the educated man, gebildet, moves. What kind of element is this? The questions we asked of Helmholtz arise here. Hegel's answer cannot satisfy us, for Hegel sees Bildung as brought to completion through the movement of alienation and appropriation, in a complete mastery of substance, in the dissolution of all concrete being, reached only in the absolute knowledge of philosophy. But we can acknowledge that Bildung is an element of spirit, without being tied to Hegel's philosophy of absolute spirit, just as the insight into the historicity of consciousness is not tied to his philosophy of world history. We must realize that the idea of perfect Bildung remains a necessary ideal even for the historical sciences that depart from Hegel. For Bildung is the element in which they move. Even what earlier usage with reference to physical appearance called perfection of form is not so much the last state of a development as the mature state that has left all development behind and makes possible the harmonious movement of all the limbs. It is precisely in this sense that the human sciences presuppose that the scholarly consciousness is already formed and for that very reason possesses the right, unlearnable, and inimitable tact that envelops the human sciences' form of judgment and mode of knowledge as if it were the element in which they move. The way that Helmholtz describes how the human sciences work, especially what he calls artistic feeling and tact, in fact presupposes this element of Bildung, within which the mind has a special free mobility. Thus Helmholtz speaks of the readiness with which the most varied experiences must flow into the memory of the historian or philologist. That may seem to be a description from an external viewpoint, namely, the ideal of the self-conscious work of drawing ironclad conclusions, according to which the natural scientist conceives himself. The concept of memory, as he uses it, is not sufficient to explain what is involved here. In fact, this tact or feeling is not rightly understood if one thinks of it as a supervening mental competence, which uses a powerful memory and so arrives at cognitive results that cannot be rigorously examined. What makes tact possible, what leads to its acquisition and possession, is not merely a piece of psychological equipment that is propitious to knowledge in the human sciences. Moreover, the nature of memory is not rightly understood if it is regarded as merely a general talent or capacity. Keeping in mind, forgetting, and recalling belong to the historical constitution of man and are themselves part of his history and his Bildung. Whoever uses his memory as a mere faculty, and any technique of memory is such a use, does not yet possess it as something that is absolutely his own. Memory must be formed, for memory is not memory for anything and everything. One has a memory for some things and not for others. One wants to preserve one thing in memory and banish another. It is time to rescue the phenomenon of memory from being regarded merely as a psychological faculty and to see it as an essential element of the finite historical being of man. In a way that has long been insufficiently noticed, forgetting is closely related to keeping in mind and remembering. Forgetting is not merely an absence and a lack, but as Nietzsche in particular pointed out, a condition of the life of mind. Only by forgetting does the mind have the possibility of total renewal, the capacity to see everything with fresh eyes, so that what is long familiar fuses with the new into a many-leveled unity. Keeping in mind is ambiguous. As memory, menaim, it is connected to remembering, anamnesis. But the same thing is also true of the concept of tact that Helmholtz uses. By tact, we understand a special sensitivity and sensitiveness to situations and how to behave in them, for which knowledge from general principles does not suffice. Hence, an essential part of tact is that it is tacit and unformulable. One can say something tactfully, but that will always mean that one passes over something tactfully and leaves it unsaid, and it is tactless to express what one can only pass over. But to pass over something does not mean to avert one's gaze from it, but to keep an eye on it in such a way that rather than knock into it, one slips by it. Thus, tact helps one to preserve distance. It avoids the offensive, the intrusive, the violation of the intimate sphere of the person. The tact of which Helmholtz speaks is not simply identical with this phenomenon of manners and customs, but they do share something essential. For the tact which functions in the human sciences is not simply a feeling and unconscious, but is at the same time a mode of knowing and a mode of being. This can be seen more clearly from the above analysis of the concept of Bildung. What Helmholtz calls tact includes Bildung and is a function of both aesthetic and historical Bildung. One must have a sense for the aesthetic and the historical, or acquire it, if one is to be able to rely on one's tact in work in the human sciences. Because this sense is not simply part of one's natural equipment, we rightly speak of aesthetic or historical consciousness, and not properly of sense. Still, this consciousness accords well with the immediacy of the senses, i.e., it knows how to make sure distinctions and evaluations in the individual case without being able to give its reasons. Thus, someone who has an aesthetic sense knows how to distinguish between the beautiful and the ugly, high and low quality, and whoever has a historical sense knows what is possible for an age and what is not, and has a sense of the otherness of the past in relation to the present. If all that presupposes Bildung, then what is in question is not a procedure or behavior, but what has come into being. It is not enough to observe more closely, to study a tradition more thoroughly, if there is not already a receptivity to the otherness of the work of art, or of the past. That is what, following Hegel, we emphasized as the general characteristic of Bildung, keeping oneself open to what is other, to other, more universal points of view. It embraces a sense of proportion and distance in relation to itself, and hence consists in rising above itself to universality. To distance oneself from oneself, and from one's private purposes, means to look at these in the way that others see them. This universality is by no means a universality of the concept or understanding. This is not a case of a particular being determined by a universal. Nothing is proved conclusively. The universal viewpoints to which the cultivated man, gebildet, keeps himself open are not a fixed applicable yardstick, but are present to him only as the viewpoints of possible others. Thus, the cultivated consciousness has in fact more the character of a sense. For every sense, e.g., the sense of sight, is already universal in that it embraces its sphere, remains open to a particular field, and grasps the distinctions within what is open to it in this way. In that such distinctions are confined to one particular sphere at a time, whereas cultivated consciousness is active in all directions. Such consciousness surpasses all of the natural sciences. It is a universal sense, a universal and common sense. This formulation of the nature of Bildung suggests an extensive historical context, a reflection on the idea of Bildung like that which lies at the basis of Helmholtz's thinking leads us far back into the history of this concept. We must pursue this context a little if we want to liberate the problem the human sciences present for philosophy from the artificial narrowness in which 19th century methodology was caught. The modern concept of science and the associated concept of method are insufficient. What makes the human sciences into sciences can be understood more easily from the tradition of the concept of Bildung than from the modern idea of scientific method. It is to the humanistic tradition that we must turn. In its resistance to the claims of modern science, it gains a new significance. It would be worth making a separate investigation into the way in which, since the days of humanism, criticism of scholastic science has made itself heard, and how this criticism has changed with the changes of its opponent. Originally, it was classical motifs that were revived in it. The enthusiasm with which the humanists proclaimed the Greek language and the path of eruditio signified more than an antiquarian passion. The revival of the classical languages brought with it a new valuation of rhetoric. It waged battle against the school, i.e., scholastic science, and supported an ideal of human wisdom that was not achieved in the school, an antithesis which in fact is found at the very beginning of philosophy. Plato's critique of sophism, and still more, his peculiarly ambivalent attitude towards Socrates, indicate the philosophical problem that emerges here. Beginning with the new methodological awareness of 17th century science, this old problem inevitably became more critical. In view of this new science's claim to be exclusive, the question of whether the humanistic concept of Bildung was not a special source of truth was raised with increased urgency. In fact, we shall see that it is from the survival of the humanistic idea of Bildung that the human sciences of the 19th century draw, without admitting it, their own life. At the same time, it is self-evident that it is not mathematics, but humanistic studies that are important here. For what could the new methodology of the 17th century mean for the human sciences? One has only to read the appropriate chapters of the Logique de Port Royal concerning the rules of reason applied to historical truths to see how little can be achieved in the human sciences by that idea of method. Its results are really trivial. For example, the idea that in order to judge an event in its truth, one must take account of the accompanying circumstances. With this kind of argument, the Jansenists sought to provide a methodical way of showing to what extent miracles deserved belief. They countered an untested belief in miracles with the spirit of the new method, and sought in this way to legitimate the true miracles of biblical and ecclesiastical tradition. The new science in the service of the old church, that this relationship could not last, is only too clear, and one can foresee what had to happen when the Christian presuppositions themselves were questioned. When the methodological ideal of the natural sciences was applied to the credibility of the historical testimonies of scriptural tradition, it inevitably led to completely different results that were catastrophic for Christianity. There is no great distance between the criticism of miracles in the style of the Jansenists and historical criticism of the Bible. Spinoza is a good example of this. I shall show later that a logically consistent application of this method as the only norm for the truth of the human sciences would amount to their self-annihilation.